case, and that's what we will do. So, Mr. Wood, you can call your next witness, please.
Next witness will be Dr. Michele Quiroga.
Ma'am, good afternoon. You'll take the witness stand right here. Remain standing when you get there so the clerk can administer to you.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Proceed.
Thank you. If you'll first start us out with your full legal name.
My name is Michele Quiroga. First name is spelled Michelequiroga.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm a clinical and forensic neuropsychologist.
And where is your office located or your practice?
My office is located in Colley, Florida, which is within the Miami area.
Okay. Now, if you could tell the jury about your educational background first.
I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I received a master's degree in 1992 and a PhD in 1996. I've been licensed since 1997 in the state of Florida.
Do you see patients as part of your practice?
I do.
Okay. And are you a neuropsychologist by yourself? Are you part of a professional association? How do you have yourself set up?
In my company or
your company?
I have several associates that work in my office, and I'm also a member of the American Psychological Association, the National Academy of Neuropsychology, the International Neuropsychological Association as well.
Now, have you, in your background, your experience, ever testified as an expert in neuropsychology?
Yes.
And about how many times?
60, 70 times.
Okay. Federal or state court?
Both.
Okay. And in the state of Florida, have you testified as an expert in that field?
Yes.
When's the last time you testified as an expert?
I was in Duval County last Thursday, July 19th.
Okay. And was that a criminal case?
A criminal capital case.
And do you do much work in capital cases?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And do you also do the same type of work in civil cases?
I do.
Okay. Now, when you're involved in testifying as an expert, is it just on particular issues of impairment, competency? I mean, how would you describe the areas for which you provide expert testimony?
I've provided expert testimony on civil cases, mostly on brain and spinal cord injury, because the specialty area of neuropsychology has to do with the psychological principles and how the structural and function of the brain applies to psychological principles and behavior. So in civil cases, when people get injured and have mild to severe injuries, either the brain or their spinal cord, and how does that affect their behavior? In criminal cases, I've testified on competency, dementia, brain impairment, psychological issues, mitigation.
You may have defined it, but just so the jury knows, what's the difference between a psychologist and a neuropsychologist?
Well, a neuropsychologist is a psychologist, but I have extra training in terms of years and study work with brain processes and disorders that involve the brain.
Okay. Now, did you... Are you, just in terms of your background, are you currently the director of neuropsychology at the Wine Center?
worked at the Lean Center for Memory Disorders, which is a clinic that diagnoses brain impairment and dementia at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach. I no longer work there. I decided to do full-time private practice again after I retired from the UM School of Medicine after 17 years.
Gotcha. Some folks who are in certain medical, psychological fields, they do like clinical research. Is your expertise in the area of the research component of it, or seeing patients doing clinical work?
Well, early on in my career, when I was a resident, I published several papers in substance abuse, HIV, and how it affects the brain, and also I co-authored a chapter on dementia and what are clinical issues that clinicians should look at. But currently I haven't published in a long time. My focus has been on my clinical work, and after I graduated and did my fellowship, I focused on working within the medical center and teaching pre-doctoral, post-doctoral students, medical residents, psychiatry students, and I was an associate professor at the University of Miami School of Medicine. So part of my time was teaching and part of my time was clinical work and having students follow me around and learn.
Okay. And can you give the jury an approximation of how many criminal and civil cases you consulted on?
Criminal and civil?
Yes.
Probably close to 350, 400 cases.
Okay. And of those, how many capital cases have you consulted on?
Capital cases, I've done over 250.
Okay. Now, when you're doing or consulting as an expert in criminal cases, are you primarily, and we can break it up, the state versus federal level. On the state level, are you primarily working on behalf of the defense or for the state?
I'm primarily working for the defense.
On federal cases, how does that work out proportionally?
On federal cases, it's partial time for the U.S. Attorney's Office, part time for the Federal Defender's Office.
Okay. And so the jury knows when we're talking about federal cases, would that be federal criminal cases?
Yes.
All right. And so in those instances where you testify for the U.S. Attorney's Office, you would get paid by the U.S. Attorney's Office, or vice versa, if you work for the Public Defender's Office on the federal level, they would pay.
Yes, or a judge has asked me to be a tiebreaker, you know, what was my opinion on both sides, and assist the judge in terms of making a decision.
Now, during the, well, first of all, you were, when did you become involved in this case?
In 2017, my first interview with Mr. Colley, it was October 3rd, 2017.
And prior to that, before you actually met Mr. Colley, had you been in contact, or were they with you, any member of his defense team?
Yes, his other attorney and the mitigation specialist.
Okay. And, okay, so how many times did you meet with Mr. Colley, and on what days were they?
I met with him on 6 occasions. I met with him on October 3rd, 2017, October 4th, 2017, October 5th, 2017, November 16th, 2017, December 21st, 2017, and May 18th, 2018.
And were all those occasions at the St. Johns County Jail?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I guess we should do this on the record. Do you see Mr. Colley here in the courtroom?
Yes, I do.
Can you point him out and describe the article of clothing he's wearing?
He's wearing a suit with a pink tie.
Okay. May the record reflect she's identified the defendant.
So, for the record.
Thank you. Now, did you also, before meeting with Mr. Colley, receive, and I'll ask you to do this in kind of generalized terms, Any documentation, reports,
Yes.
that sort of thing?
Yes, I did.
And can you describe, the categories of items that you received in the course of the case?
I received some depositions. I received Mr. Colley's medical records, his prescription records. I also received his father's medical records from the VA.
Okay. And did the other records include such things as like police reports, witness statements, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And when you're meeting with Mr. Colley, did you, in terms of your professional ability to render an opinion in this case on certain issues, did you take into consideration those things that Mr. Colley told you during the course of your interviews with him?
I did take into consideration the information he gave me during my interviews.
Okay. As well as the other documentation that you received?
Yes.
Okay.
As well as family interviews.
Okay. Now, and I'll just kind of break this up a little bit. Was there ever a time in 2015 that Mr. Colley, the defendant, was being treated for depression?
Yes, he was.
Okay. And do you know how he was being treated? Was he prescribed any medication?
Yes, he was prescribed medication by his general physician. It was an antidepressant.
And from a neuropsychological perspective, what is depression?
Depression is a disorder that involves a sadness. It involves several symptoms in terms of decreased energy. They can have irritability, lose weight, gain weight, have difficulty sleeping. They have various symptoms.
Okay. And do you know when Mr. Colley started taking the medication for depression?
Not off the top of my head right now.
Okay. And do you know what type of medications he was taking for depression?
An antidepressant.
Okay. Do you know the name of it?
Wellbutrin, and then it changed, or his physician changed the medication to not Celexa, was another antidepressant because the Wellbutrin wasn't effective.
To your knowledge, has Mr. Colley ever taken Cymbalta?
It was Cymbalta.
Okay. Is that also an antidepressant?
It is.
Okay. Now, did you gather information during your course of involvement in this case, certain things with regard to Mr. Colley's alcohol intake?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell the jury about that?
Well, he meets criteria for an alcohol use disorder. He is a heavy drinker. How does the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Addictions classify a heavy drinker? It's having 5 drinks or more, 5 days within a 30-day period. Mr. Colley would drink on a daily basis.
Okay. And according to the information you gathered, let me ask it this way before I ask that question. The information regarding Mr. Colley's alcohol intake, did you gather that from just Mr. Colley, or was there other sources for that information?
The family also told me that he drank excessively.
Okay. And for how long has Mr. Colley had this alcohol dependency issue?
Well, in my opinion, at first he was binge drinking, which means that there was, if he drank 5 drinks and he wouldn't know how to stop. And that does classify for an alcohol use disorder. But as he had more marital problems, he continued to abuse alcohol more, and at an increased level.
Also, with regard to the antidepressant, was that generally related to issues of his marriage at that time? Him taking the antidepressants?
Well, it's difficult to see what came first.
Right.
If it was
the alcoholism or the
alcoholism or the depression, because people self-medicate that are depressed and have anxiety disorders. And if the alcoholism was the primary diagnosis, you're 2 times likely to have a mood or anxiety disorder secondary to your alcohol or drug abuse disorder.
So
And vice versa, you know.
So then can alcohol abuse have an impact on or be the causation of depression?
Yes, it can be.
If one already has depression or depressive disorder, would alcohol affect that in any significant, alcohol abuse affect that in any way?
Yes, alcohol is a downer, and you'll have more likely to have negative emotions secondary to the alcohol use. It's not a stimulant, it's a downer.
How does long-term alcohol abuse affect the brain from a neurological, medical perspective?
Well, your priorities and your desires change. Instead of having, let's say, family or something be a priority, it's the alcohol, and that's part of the addiction. And you can distort reality, you can have confusion, have impairments in your relationships, so it does alter your brain.
Did you get any information about whether Mr. Colley preferred a particular kind of alcohol, or was it just pretty much anything he could get his hands on, or how would you characterize that based on your collection of information?
It was mostly Crown Royal, but he also drank beer.
Okay. Now, do you know if in 2015 Mr. Colley was receiving any treatment, or was he receiving any treatment for his alcohol abuse in 2015?
No.
Okay. Are you aware of any instances in his past, even before 2015, where he either was receiving or sought treatment for his alcohol abuse?
He didn't seek treatment for his alcohol abuse.
Now, do you, having obviously met with Mr. Colley on several occasions, since he's been incarcerated in 2015, obviously you met him for the first time when he was incarcerated. In your opinion, does he suffer from depression now?
Yes, he does.
All right. And on what basis do you say that?
Well, there are 2 main factors in why he's suffering from depression. The first factor is that he lost his best friend. His best friend and his best man were what was his father. And right now his dad is dying. His dad suffered a stroke during his incarceration, and he is bedbound. He cannot perform any activities of daily living. I went in and I assessed him, and that's why he's not here in this courtroom. Because
You're talking about the father?
The father, because he's very, very sick and doesn't make any sense and has severe memory problems and is in late stages of dementia. His deconditioning in his body, he can't leave the bed. He can't even be in a wheelchair, and he's total assistance for feeding, bathing, shifting in his bed.
Okay. How about his, has his
Well, there's
loss of contact with his children, is that having an effect on the issue of depression?
That's the second thing or the second factor that contributes to his depression. Mr. Colley was a hands-on dad. He talked to me about bathing the kids daily. He would feed the kids, talk to me about Sunday Fun Day, where they would have Sunday night dinners and spend the whole day as a family. Every day after work, he would change his clothes and play in the yard with his kid. He also misses fishing and just being outside with them.
Now, how is Mr. Colley doing as far as adjusting to his incarceration from a mental health, psychological perspective?
From a mental health perspective, he has done very, very well incarcerated. He has obtained a legal paralegal certificate. He's helped other inmates within the jail with their legal work. He reads, he's an avid reader, and one important thing with his case is that he has consistent support. He has daily access to his family on the phone, sometimes several times a day. He connects with his mother, his sister, his friends, and on a weekly basis, he has visits from neighbors, co-workers, friends, and family that really care about him.
Now, let's talk a little bit about, or did you get any information with regard to any cocaine usage by Mr. Colley?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
He told me on the night of the incident that he did 2 lines of cocaine.
Are you aware, was it reported to you that there have been other times when Mr. Colley's done cocaine?
He didn't deny that he's done cocaine before. I think that was more so if he was partying. The alcohol was his main issue. But there's no doubt that he did have cocaine use.
Is alcohol dependency a recognized mental health disorder accepted in the community of psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals?
Yes.
And is depression a recognized mental health disorder recognized within the psychological and mental health profession?
Yes, it is.
In your collection of information in this case, did Mr. Colley ever suffer from any anxiety disorders?
He did.
Tell us about that.
In 2015, he was also suffering from periodic panic attacks and a significant anxiety disorder.
And was he receiving any treatment for the anxiety disorder?
He was self-medicating with alcohol.
You know, we hear the words panic attack. Does that have any medical or psychological significance in your field?
Yes, he had occasional panic attacks where he would get very nervous. He feels like the world is ending. His heart would beat fast and not consistently, but he told me about specific panic attacks.
Well, panic attacks, do they have a neurological effect on the body or on the system?
It's difficult to think straight when you think that the worst is going to happen at that point when the panic attack is happening.
Okay. Just one minute. Sure.
I think an important aspect of panic attacks, some people can't believe that things are real, that they're really happening. So there's a derealization of, is this for real? And they could perceive something that is, they think it's extremely stressful when it really isn't that stressful at all.
So from a neurological or psychological perspective, can having a panic attack alter one's perception of reality?
Yes. you distort reality and what's real. You're not going to have a heart attack, and you're not going to die, and the worst isn't going to happen.
Anything else? Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Dr. Quiroga.
Good afternoon.
You also did some neuropsychological testing, did you, when you met with him on all those occasions?
Yes, I did.
Okay, you actually performed, I think, 10 different neuropsychological tests.
I believe it was 14.
14, okay, not 10, 14. And has it been true on just about every single one of those, with the exception of maybe the one for ADD or ADHD, the defendant showed that there was no evidence of any deficits with regard to any of those tests. Is that correct?
Correct.
And can you just kind of tell us kind of what you were testing for?
Well, the evaluation was to determine if he had any memory problems. So I did several tests of memory and malingering of memory to see if he was faking his memory impairment. But he did not have any memory deficits, and he put forth adequate effort on all my testing.
Okay, but that's not, those were the only kind of tests, the neuropsychological tests that you did, were they?
I also did IQ testing, their attention, concentration, and executive functioning testing, meaning tests that tell me how the person problem solves, how they shift from one thing to another.
Okay, and when it came to executive functioning, his ability to problem solve, you found no deficits in those areas, did you?
No, I did not.
And on his IQ test, you found him to be about average, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about the information that the defendant gave you concerning what occurred on the night before and then on the day of this particular event that occurred on August the 27th of 2015. Starting with the night before, August the 26th, the defendant told you, did he not, that he had drank some Crown Royal the night before, is that correct?
Yes.
At his house?
What date?
August the 26th, 2015.
What date of my notes that you're referring to, so that I can find?
I'll have to let you refer to your own notes. I have mine, and I'll let you refer to your own.
Okay, I found them.
Okay. He was at home the night before, correct?
Yes, well, at his sister's house.
And at some point he gets contacted by his friend Daryl. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was around 11 o'clock.
Around 11 o'clock, 10:30, 11.
Okay. And then he goes to meet with Daryl. Is that correct?
Yes.
Over in Orange Park.
Correct.
And he's with Daryl from 11 p.m. till 2 o'clock in the morning. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And he had some drinks with Daryl, did he not?
Correct.
And then I think you had testified before that he did, was it 2 lines of cocaine?
Yes.
And that was during that 11 p.m., 2 a.m. time frame, correct?
I have it in my notes that the 2 lines of cocaine occurred at 2 a.m.
Okay. And then he drove Daryl home, correct?
Yes.
And then he went home, is that correct?
Correct.
And then after he went home, he decided to go check on Amanda Colley, his estranged wife, correct?
Yes.
At her house.
Correct.
And that was because he decided to do that because she was sick,
Yes.
and he wanted to make sure that she was okay.
Correct.
Did he tell you what other reason that he thought he might go see his estranged wife?
Yes.
And what was that for?
Sex.
Okay, so he told you that he was going to check on her because she was sick, and because he was hoping to get some sex from her.
Yes.
So at 3:15, he pulls up at her house, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did he tell you how he got to her house?
Driving.
Okay. Did he tell you where he drove to? Did he drive up in the driveway? Did he park somewhere else?
He went into the garage.
Okay, that's not my question. My question is, where did he park his vehicle? Did he tell you?
I don't remember specifically where he parked his vehicle, but I have a note that he went in through the garage.
Okay. He used the garage door clicker, right?
Yes.
All right. And in your discussions with him, did he tell you about the injunction that prohibited him from being there at the house?
Yes.
So he goes into the garage, he uses the clicker to get inside. He doesn't find her, Amanda, in the home, correct?
Correct.
And then that's when he decided to kind of take a look around and goes to the bedroom, and he found some items within the bedroom, correct?
Yes.
Some sex toys as well as some men's clothing, correct?
Yes.
And again, this is what the defendant is telling you, right?
Correct.
All right. And he took these items as evidence that his wife was cheating on him, correct?
Yes.
And then while he's there, he destroys some TVs, correct? That's what he told you, right?
Yes.
He broke the TVs, he knocked over some trash cans, flung things around, is that correct?
Correct.
And then he leaves there and he goes to Mike Dickens' house, is that right?
Yes. The neighbors, Mike and Gals.
Okay. And then he leaves Mike Dickens' house, and then he starts texting and calling Amanda, is that right?
Correct.
And at some point during this, Amanda's not responding to these initial calls and texts, correct?
As far as I know.
He eventually texts her and tells her that one of their children is sick, and that prompts her to give him a call, correct?
I don't remember that specific text, and we didn't talk about it.
He did have a conversation at one point with Amanda, correct?
As far as I know.
And during that conversation, the defendant told you that he told Amanda that he would give her $500 to replace the TVs that he destroyed, correct?
Yes.
And he said that Amanda told him that she wasn't going to call the cops, they would just deal with it the next day, is that right?
Correct.
And so at that point is when he goes home and he takes to Ambien, correct?
Yes.
And that was at between 5 and 5:30?
Correct.
And he told you that after taking the Ambien, he was comatose, correct?
Yes.
And comatose means you're out, correct?
Yes.
Unconscious, just like how we imagine somebody being in the hospital when you can't be awakened, correct?
Yes.
And he slept from 5 o'clock to 7:30, correct?
Yes.
And he told you that at 7:30 his dad woke him up, is that right?
Correct.
Told him he was late for court, is that right?
Yes, he did.
And he told you that he went to court and drove his sister Rhonda's car, is that right?
Yes.
And then he gets to court. He tells you that what is, and we don't have to get into the specifics about it, but he told you what he was in court for, correct?
Yes.
And what happened in court, right?
I don't specifically remember, but let me refer to my notes. Remember that the judge gave him anger management classes to go to? I don't remember the specific amount.
Okay. That's what he told you?
Yes.
That's what he told you happened in court, correct? Said he met with his attorney there too, right?
I don't remember that he met with his attorney.
And approach the witness, Your Honor. Dr. Quiroga, this is a transcript of your deposition just the other day on July the 14th. You take a look at page 22 in line 4 there.
He said that an attorney was present and that he received a paper in court, you're correct, and he left it in the truck.
Okay,
Thank you.
so these were things that he had told you had happened in court, correct?
He also said something about a misdemeanor charge and it will be dismissed after completion of the anger management classes.
So he was able to convey to you basically what happened in court, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So then he leaves court and he calls Amanda on the phone after he leaves court around 9:30. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he was on the phone with her, he told you, for about 15 minutes. Is that right?
Yes.
And he was confronting her about the items that he found in her house, correct?
Yes.
And during that conversation, Amanda Colley, the defendant, told you that Amanda Colley told him that the cops were on their way to her house. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what was the defendant? What did the defendant tell you was his response to Amanda Colley telling him that?
Can you recall the question?
What did the defendant tell you was his response to Amanda Colley telling him that the police was on their way to her house?
I believe that he has to fix this.
Okay. Didn't he ask the question, he called the cops?
He called the cops and he said, I have to fix this.
Okay, but the defendant told you that he asked Amanda, he, being a male, called the cops, question mark?
Yes.
Okay. He being Amanda Colley's boyfriend, correct?
Yes.
So he had in his mind that her boyfriend had called the cops. He told you he was upset about that, didn't he?
Yes.
Said, I've got to fix this, right?
Correct.
And he was going to give her a check for the TVs, is that right?
Yes.
And so he went to her house, he told you, didn't he?
Yes.
And so where did he tell you how he got to her house?
He pulled around the backside.
Why did he do that? Why did he tell you he did that?
Because the policeman may come into the front of the house, through the front of the house, not on the backside.
Now, he had an injunction in place, so he knew that he wasn't supposed to be there at the house because of the injunction, correct?
Yes.
And he also knew, based on what he told you, that he knew the police were on their way to his wife's house, correct?
Yes.
And the defendant told you that he went over there anyway, correct?
Yes.
Even though he had an injunction, correct?
Yes.
And so because the police were there, he decided to, he told you, to go around the back side of the house to conceal his movements, correct?
Yes.
So he gets around to the back side of the house. What does he tell you he does next after he comes around the back side of the neighborhood, around the back side of the house? What did he tell you that happened next?
That he can see into the window.
So he got out of the vehicle?
I believe so. I didn't ask specifically, but all I have written down is that he can see into the window.
Okay. And what did he tell you he saw when he saw into the window?
That he saw Amanda and a guy, and this guy is in my house.
He said, this guy is in my house, correct?
Yes.
What did he tell you happened next?
That he had a panic attack, that he couldn't breathe, he had dizziness, weakness, and he felt like he was going to faint.
Okay. And at this moment is when he shot into the house and ran into the house? He told you that, correct?
He also reported...
Just first answer my question, then I'll let
Okay.
you. He told you that he shot into the house and then ran into the house? Ran through the window?
that he told me that he shot into the house.
Okay.
I have next in my notes that he ran through the window and cut his face, ear, and hands from the broken window.
Now, before he did that, I mean, he told you he remembered walking across the backyard with a gun, correct?
I didn't write it specifically down.
Any questions with Sean? Sure. Let's go back to your deposition we did just a few days ago. And starting the question is actually on page 34 at the very bottom, line 25. You can read that. And then your answer at the top of page 35. Just read to yourself and then just let me know if that refreshes your memory.
He walked across the He did say that.
Okay.
At the time of the deposition.
He
I
told-
apologize, I've been in court for the last couple
Quite all right.
of days.
I'll be fair to you. So he told you that he was walking across the backyard with the gun.
Yes.
He also told you that he shot the window until the last bullet, correct?
Yes.
He told you that he remembered Rachel and Lindy being in the closet, is that right?
As I indicated in the deposition, I interviewed him after the fact,
Okay.
and he found out that Rachel and Lindy were in the closet.
Okay.
He didn't know that Rachel and Lindy was in the closet.
Okay. He told you that he remembered kicking door frame and shooting through a door, correct?
Yes.
And then remember going back to Rhonda's house, is that right?
Yes.
And when he got to Rhonda's house, his sister's house, he grabbed an AR-15, is that right?
Yes.
And then he threw the gun that he had, one of the guns, in the car and started basically driving on the highway. Is that right?
Correct.
Fleeing, correct?
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you, Mr. Wood went through a number of things with you about what was going on with the defendant back in August of 2015. You indicated at some point that he was doing well while he was incarcerated, correct?
Yes.
And one of the reasons he was doing well was because he had a lot of family support from friends, correct?
Yes.
Had daily contact with his family and friends, correct?
Yes.
Multiple times a day, correct?
Yes.
He's also had contact with 2 girlfriends, correct?
I don't know about 2 girlfriends.
Okay. Now, a lot of the information that you're relying on to reach your opinions in this particular case is basically what James Colley has told you, correct?
Not all the information.
Well, the information about what he was thinking, what he was feeling, those kinds of things, depression, all those kinds of things, those were things that the source of that information was really from him, correct?
No, I reviewed medical records and it said that, he was on antidepressant medication, and also his family talked to me about his functioning.
His family told you that, right?
Yes.
And the antidepressants, they didn't actually, the records didn't actually tell you that he was actually taking those medications, though, did they?
No.
That information would have come basically solely from the defendant, correct?
I do remember seeing prescription bottles, but I didn't take the dates of
Did the prescription bottles tell you that he actually took what was in the bottles?
No.
That information would have only come from the defendant, correct?
Yes.
In terms of taking the Ambien, whether or not he actually took the Ambien, that information would have come solely from the defendant, correct?
Yes.
And if the defendant had been lying about any of that, that would affect your ability to provide an opinion in this particular case, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Any regrets?
Yes, sir. Just also for additional clarification, Dr. Quiroga, when you talk about receiving medical records, I believe you indicated before you also reviewed his pharmacy records as well, is that correct?
Yes.
And did those pharmacy records say that in August of 2015, Mr. Colley was taking antidepressants?
Yes.
And that they were in fact prescribed for him?
Yes.
And in fact, those prescriptions were filled at a pharmacy?
Correct.
Okay. And would that also be true with his other medications for pain as well as for sleep disorder Ambien?
Yes.
Okay. Now, also too, you, just for the record, you tested his IQ, you said he had an average IQ. What number would that be?
His full scale was at a 99.
Okay. And is that in the average range?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have anything else. Thank you
Any
very much.
regrets? Mayor. Is the Dr. Steve?
She may stick around, Judge, if you need her. She can go about her business, so we can separately recall.
You are subject to it. Thank you. Can you call your next witness, please?
Yes, let me call Dale Dickens. Judge, it'd be Dale Dickens.
Ms. Dickens, if you'll take a witness, stand right over here.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Ms. Dickens, you can take a seat. So we're going to name for it.
Thank you. Would you give us your full legal name for the record, please?
Gail Dickens,
And where do you live, Ms. Dickens?
St. Johns County,
What is your address?
249 South Bellagio Drive.
And are you married?
Yes,
And who are you married to?
Michael Dickens.
How long have you been married?
We've been married 7 years,
And how long have you lived at that address?
about 7 years. November 2011,
So did you get married and then move into that house?
around the same time.
Okay, all right. Do you have children?
We do.
How many?
2.
And how old?
Sean is 10, Addison is 5.
Okay, boy and a girl?
Yes.
Okay. And well, first of all, what do you do for a living?
I am a paralegal bookkeeper
Okay. And for yourself or for someone else?
for someone else.
All right. For a lawyer or
Yes.
what? Who do you work for?
Fred Stromberg,
And where is that office?
Jacksonville,
How long have you worked for them?
since 2007.
About the time you got married?
I'm sorry?
Let me move on then. So, about how far away did you live from Mr. Colley and Amanda on South Bellagio?
3 houses.
Now, did you know either of them before moving into your house?
No, I did not.
Okay. Did there come a time when you eventually got to know them?
Very shortly after we moved in.
Okay. Can a month, a week, a year?
Probably within a month.
Okay. And do you recall basically how it is you started to get to know them?
At the time, I just had Sean, We had Sean, and we would just be out in the circle playing, riding bikes. And their children would be out along with other neighborhood kids that live right there in the cul-de-sac.
Okay. So would it come to pass that you would start to, at some point, socialize with
Yes.
them? And when I use the word socialize, I mean, what's that about? Did you go to their house, they come to yours? I mean, how did that?
It would, in both ways. We would have cookouts, birthday parties for the kids, for us adults, just lots of time out in the circle, riding bikes, playing ball. We did Halloweens together, 4th of July.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that most of the time you've lived at your address, you've also known Mr. Colley and Amanda?
Yes.
Okay. Now, focusing on Mr. Colley, have there been occasions when you've seen him interact, play, if you will, with his own children?
Yes.
Okay. And can you describe that? What are you seeing him doing with his children?
Playing ball. I remember him teaching Trey to ride his bike.
Trey being his son?
Correct.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right.
We went to the park a lot. We went fishing. He took Sean and Trey together several times over to the park. Everything we did was very family oriented, and so we did a lot together in those few years that I was.
All right. And how did you, when you saw, Trey or Avery or both of them with their father, Mr. Colley, what were you seeing from them? How were they reacting to what they were doing?
From what I saw, they were very loving. They were happy. We laughed a lot. They laughed a lot with him. He was very affectionate. From what I saw, it's what I would describe as a normal, happy parent-child relationship.
Okay. And would this description of Mr. Colley's interaction time with his children, as you've described it, would that be the same description you would give leading up to August of 2015?
Yes.
Okay. Now, did you know that Mr. Colley had a job in 2015, that he worked?
Yes.
Okay. And did you know where he worked at?
Citibank, I believe.
Okay. So obviously you didn't work for Citibank in 2015 yourself.
No.
So when Mr. Colley was not working, would he, like when he got home, would you see him ever with the children after he got off work?
Sure, other than when it would be dark at 5:30, and that time of the year, there wasn't very many nights that we all weren't outside socializing, playing with our kids, or just hanging out and talking, or having dinners together after work. It just whatever the day brought.
Okay.
But almost on a nightly basis.
Okay. Did you see that same activity, the week prior to the shooting? Him playing with his kids?
There was a time, yes.
Okay. When you saw that, what did you see? When you saw him playing with his kids, what activities were you seeing?
They were playing in their backyard.
Where? In the house on Bellagio?
At 260, yes.
Okay. And what were they, when they're playing, what are you seeing?
We were at the park with our kids, so I just looked over and saw them just outside running around playing,
Okay.
laughing.
Okay. And the kids are with Mr. Colley?
Yes, Mr. Colley was there.
Okay. And, okay. Now, haven't been to your neighborhood before? You've got a park that's near where you live?
Yeah, so where 260 South Bellagio is, where their house is, it's you can see the park from the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just got some slides, a couple of park benches and tables.
Okay. How is Mr. Colley around your children?
He was a good, they had fun. They love Mr. James. My kids absolutely adore him.
Would they do the same kind of activities?
Absolutely.
Okay. That include hunting and fishing? And
My kids did not go hunting,
okay.
but he did take Sean fishing. My 10-year-old, My 10-year-old has Down syndrome, and not a lot of people take a lot of interest in learning about him and figuring out what he's saying. His speech isn't that great, and Mr. Colley was always took a really big interest in Sean. Would always make sure he had a good day. Would talk to him. Always included him when he would take Trey over to the park, or so yeah.
Okay. And I don't want to get, if it results in emotions, certainly, so be it, but some people who have Down syndrome have it worse in terms of mobility or impairment.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe the disabilities or abilities of your son?
Sean doesn't really have a lot he can't do.
Okay, good.
So if Trey was trying to ride his bike, Jared would help him get on the bike and help him move around some if he, ride the bike, or teaching him how to throw the ball properly, or trying to teach him how to catch the ball. I mean, that was always what we did.
Okay. And when we talk about ball, is that football, baseball, softball?
Baseball, usually.
Okay. All right.
Frisbee. I think we played Frisbee a couple times. That was always fun.
Okay. The park that you described, when they play baseball, is it over there or somewhere?
No, the park that's up at the amenity center at the front of the neighborhood.
Okay. All right. And so in terms of Mr. Colley dealing with being with your son, would you describe him as being a patient person?
Yes.
Okay.
It takes a lot of patience to deal with Sean.
Okay. All right. So same thing with your other child. Good relationship with Mr. Colley?
Yes. He was probably the third person on our street to come over when we brought her home from the hospital, to come over and meet her and hold her.
Oh, when she was first born?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So did you, do you recall at any time if Mr. Colley was ever involved in coaching?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I believe he coached Trey's football and the baseball team.
Okay. All right. Were either of your children involved in his coaching activities?
No.
Okay. All right. Were there times did you ever see Mr. Colley interact with other children in the neighborhood?
Yes, we have another set of neighbors who all 6 of the kids were very close in age. So they were all probably about a year apart, and so there would be 6 of them out there most nights.
Okay. Doing things with Mr. Colley?
Yes.
What kind of things?
Bike riding, ball, the same kind of things that you just play outside just to expend some energy at the end of the day.
From your observations of what you saw in Mr. Colley's interaction with the children, did they seem to enjoy what they were doing with Mr. Colley?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. When you saw the activities with the neighbors, were his children also involved in that at times, or your children?
Yes.
Okay. And did you see this kind of activity over a period of time, or was it just one time kind of thing?
No, it was probably, like I said, pretty much every day when it wasn't dark at 5:30, from the time that shortly after we moved in until August of 2015.
Did you, have you had occasions to observe Mr. Colley's interaction with his family, his sisters, his mother?
On occasion, we would have holiday get-togethers like 4th of July or birthday parties. His sisters were on there, Crystal would be there, and his mom and dad would usually be there.
And from your observations of Mr. Colley being around his family, how would you describe them? Do they appear to be close, distant? I mean, how would you?
It did, from my observations, they appear to be a close family.
And I guess I should also ask you, how would you describe your relationship with Mr. Colley over the several years that you've lived next to him?
He's my friend. We became really good friends with their family. A lot of our activities were together with them, with him and his family. And through the years, we became friends.
That's all. Thank you very much. State may answer questions.
Cross-examination, state.
evening, Ms. Dickens. You just finished talking about you're really good friends with the defendant, and you were good friends with Amanda and his entire family at the time, correct?
Our families were friends, yes.
And that goes back from 2001, 2011, up until the time of the homicide, is that right?
Correct.
And so when you hung out with the defendant, it was as a family. It was you, your husband, and children, along with him, Amanda, and their children.
Most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah. And during this time, you were good friends with that. You became aware during that time of some problems in the marriage, correct?
Yes.
And you became aware that there was an injunction, correct?
Correct.
And you became aware that at some point the defendant was no longer living on Bellagio. He was living with his sister, Rhonda.
Correct.
And during that time, he was continuing to talk to both you and your husband about his marriage and what was going on between him and Amanda. Is that right?
Mostly probably with my husband more than me.
He told you that he was...
Objection, Judge, is outside the scope of direct.
Go ahead and ask the question.
He told you that he felt that Lindy was interfering in his marriage.
Objection, Your Honor, outside the scope.
Sustain your objection.
During your times in speaking with the defendant, especially towards the progression of that summer and leading up to the homicide, did he ever express any dislike and call Amanda bad names?
Objection, outside the scope of direct.
Yeah.
Overruled.
Would he call her names to me?
Yes, were you aware he called Amanda a bitch? To you?
To me? I don't recall, but he may, I don't recall that.
You don't recall that?
He may have, I don't recall every conversation we had.
And were you aware he called her an asshole to you?
Objection, outside the scope of direct.
Overruled.
Again, I don't recall any specific conversation, but
Okay. Do you recall when we met just a few weeks ago and your deposition was taken in this matter?
right.
And Your Honor, and at that time you were took an oath and you swore to tell the truth like just like today. Your Honor, may I approach, please?
You may.
I'm going to ask you, for the record, it's page 13. Just read the question on line 10, the answer on line 11 to yourself. And I'll ask what kind of questions you.
Yeah.
And you stated in your deposition that when asked, did you ever hear him call her a bitch? Your answer was probably. Is that right?
Yes.
Were you aware during this time of the photograph your husband had sent of the person cutting the grass? The
Yes.
man cutting the grass, right?
Yes.
You're aware of that?
Outside the scope of direct.
Overruled.
And you testified previously that that photograph was sent to Rhonda and not James in order to avoid an explosion. Is that correct?
Objection, no, outside the scope.
Overruled.
Yes.
Nothing further, Judge.
Any redirections for
No,
it?
Your Honor.
Is Ms. Dickens excused?
We'll excuse your Judge.
Mr. Woodrow, your next witness.
Marie Over-Isaac. Hyphenate, Over-Isaac, Marie.
Ma'am, if you'll come up here, go ahead and stand right here. You'll remain standing. Raise your right hand, please.
Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, ma'am.
Take a seat. Mr. Wood, you may inquire.
Thank you. Would you give us your full legal name to start us off?
My full name is Maria Ann Obert Isaac.
And is it hyphenated?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And for the benefit of the courtroom, order. Could you spell first Obert and then Isaac?
OBERT-ISAAC.
And where do you live?
Jacksonville, Florida.
And do you work?
Yes, sir.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a wellness manager.
Okay, for who?
I work for Genpack.
Okay, all right. Now, are you related at all to Mr. Colley?
He's my cousin. Our mothers are our sisters. They had 5 kids between them. It was my cousin Rhonda and myself, and then my brother Lewis, and then Crystal, and then JR was the baby.
All right. Every family's different. I guess I'm a little silly, but how would you, I know you're cousins, how would you describe, though, the nature of your relationship with Mr. Colley? Is he close? Do you see him very often? I mean, how can you give a description on that?
I love him very much. We see each other at every family function. I wouldn't say that him and I go out, just him and I, and do things, but the family always comes together, and that's when I would see him and the kids and Amanda.
Okay. So, obviously he's incarcerated now, but going, say, back from using that time frame of 2015 going backwards, can you give the jury some idea of how often you would be in contact with Mr. Colley?
Well, every Easter's, Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July. When I first moved here, the family would all get together every Sunday and eat at Famous Amos and just eat every Sunday together.
Okay. Where'd you move from?
I moved here from the West Coast.
Okay. And, okay. And so when you would be spending time with Mr. Colley, would that be with him and his family?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, do you have children of your own?
No, sir.
Okay. I should also ask you, are you married?
I'm single.
Okay. Just wanted to kind of give the jury an idea of, when you're together with Mr. Colley, what the scene was like. So have you had occasions to see Mr. Colley around his children, interacting with his children? How would you describe what you saw?
I think he's a great father. Trey is definitely a man's man. JR would take him hunting and fishing and teach him about sports. I think that most dads and sons do that kind of thing, but he still had just such the sweetest spirit of a little boy. One thing that kind of stands out to me is not that 4th of July, but the one before that. We had all met in the cul-de-sac where they lived, and we had sparklers for the kids, and JR was lighting them and everything, and one of the little neighbor kids has Down syndrome, and I looked at JR with Trey there, and I said, is he special? And Trey looked over at me, he says, no, he just has Down syndrome. And then JR rubbed his head, and I just thought, wow, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. Okay. Would that, do you know the parents, who the parents are of that child?
They live in the neighborhood. I think it's Gail and Mike.
Okay. All right. So, did you, back in 2015, did you know Mr. Colley was employed, if he was working?
He's always worked as far as, since he's, high school, he's always worked. We're in the, I was in mortgage until recently, and within mortgage, you do get laid off, but then you just hop over to the next bank. So there might have been a month or two between jobs, because when you get downsized, you get a severance package so that you have time to find another job. Okay. But we actually all worked together at PHH at one point.
I was going to ask you about that. For the benefit of the jury, what or who is PHS?
PHH was a mortgage company in Jacksonville, Florida. I was a sales consultant there. I also originated and processed mortgages. JR was a processor, as was Amanda, Rhonda, Dan, Crystal. We all worked there at one point. But they're private label mortgagers. So like if you got a mortgage with anyone that wasn't Citibank or Chase, PHH Mortgage did the mortgage for it.
You mentioned Dan. Who was Dan?
Rhonda's husband.
Okay. Rhonda being Mr. Colley's sister.
Yes, sir.
Crystal would be Mr. Colley's sister as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And, okay. So the time that you're with PHH, was he, Mr. Colley, there the whole time that you were there, or did
He
that?
worked there before I got there. He was one of the people that got me on. I was working for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and he was like, says you need to come over here and see what you can do over here. The only thing I knew about mortgages is that I had one, and so they taught me how to do mortgages, and so I worked there. I was there for 10 years before I was downsized, but he left before I did on his own accord.
So Mr. Colley would, while he was with PHH, would help train you, mentor you, that sort of thing?
He was a processor. He processed mortgages after you would sign to get a mortgage. He would process it so it could go to closing. You could purchase the home. And then I don't think it was a supervisor then, but I know he was a supervisor at Chase in the loan processing department.
When you were there in that company, how would you, and were able to observe Mr. Colley as a fellow employee, how would you describe him as a fellow employee?
I think that he's always been well-liked no matter where he's worked, and I think our whole family has a very strong work ethic. I think that we've always, worked hard and, did every job that we've ever been given to the best of our ability. But he was very well-liked. Made it easy for me.
Do I know?
I said it made it a little easier for me.
Okay. So he was well-liked within the working group?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Do you have knowledge of where else Mr. Colley would have worked at?
Well, I know he's worked at Chase, and I know he's worked at City.
Okay. Chase, what did you do for Chase?
Mortgage. He's been in mortgage for a long time.
Would that also be true with City?
Yes.
Okay. Which came first, Chase or City, or do you recall?
City and then Chase, I believe.
Okay. Okay. And did you know him or his employment history before PHH?
Not that I can recall. I mean, when he was a teenager, because, I'm closer to Ron's age, so I'm like 10 years older. He worked at like a pizza place when he was in high school. I think that was one of his first jobs he'd ever had.
Okay. Would that be over in the Daytona area?
Yes.
Okay. And in all fairness, you lived over the West Coast previously, so let me ask you this. When you were living on the West Coast, were you as in contact and spending time with Mr. Colley less than when you did move over into this area?
Oh, I see him a lot more now than, well, not now, but I see him a lot more since I moved here.
Right.
I was in the military. I was in the Navy, so I was stationed out west. So when I moved here, I really got to spend some time with him and get to know who he was, because I lived with Rhonda and Dan, and JR lived with Rhonda and Dan at the time as well. So we really, we hung out quite a bit.
Can you give the jury a time frame then on when you were living with Rhonda and Dan, and when would that have been?
01. I lived with them for about 6 months before I moved out on my own. And then I just moved down the road because I want to be close to family.
Where Rhonda and Dan were living at that time, was it the same residence they have now or a different place?
No, sir. They lived over on Freckles Court in Orange Park, right near the school there. And then after I had moved out and bought my house, eventually they moved to Southampton, the Garrison Drive residence, and JR and Amanda actually JR bought the house on Freckles.
I got you. So just to kind of sync the time frame, when you're living with Dan and Rhonda, JR, Mr. Colley's living there also?
Yes, sir.
For the same period, you said about 6 months you lived there, was that?
I lived there for 6 months, but Jay lived there longer.
Okay. All right. Do you recall at that time in Orange Park when you were there, and JR was living in the house, do you remember if he was working anywhere at that time?
Of course.
Where was that at?
I think it could have been PHH, I'm not real sure, but he was working.
Okay. All right. So would you describe Mr. Colley as a good father from your observation?
Absolutely.
Did you know of his involvement, any involvement with, that Mr. Colley had with regard to football?
He taught Trey's Little League.
Okay. Do you remember about when that was?
About a year before the incident.
So about 2014?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And was that in the neighborhood there in Southampton, or was that some other location that he was?
I'm not real sure.
Okay. All right. Okay. Just a minute. How would you describe Mr. Colley's relationship to his own family, his parents, his sisters? Are they close? Are they distant? How would you describe that?
Extremely close. I think our family is close, but the five of them are extremely close. Him and his dad had a Mustang that they would go drag race at the race track, and it just made Christmas really easy to get him things. So I could just buy the racetrack stuff, and so that he could work on his car. So him and his dad did that. And then, the Daytona races, they would go and do that. And, we would do family reunions up in West Virginia. We would all carpool 2 or 3 cars together and travel up to West Virginia, Kentucky area. We would stay in this rundown little motel that was called the Inez, and it was really not awesome, but it was us getting to get together. And my grandpa, who's gone now, he lived up in Ohio, and he would come down, as would my brother and his wife and kids. So it's like everybody got together, and we would go and eat and hear preaching and singing and good bluegrass music. And so we would all do that, and we did trips to Biloxi, all of us. I mean, it's not just those 5, just all of us would go. But I would say they're extremely close.
So at one time, Mr. Colley had his own race car?
Yes.
Okay.
They still own it.
Okay.
They just don't race it anymore.
For about how long a period of time did he race it, to your knowledge?
2 years.
Okay.
He won a couple of things.
Did he keep the car on his property, or keep it somewhere else?
Well, it's at his mom and dad's house now, but it was at his house.
Would he, Mr. Colley, did he do mechanical work on the car, that sort of thing?
Yes, sir.
Would you use, from your observation, so Mr. Colley has some auto mechanic ability as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And when I think of race car, I'm thinking of paint job, stickers on the race car, all that sort of, would that be true with this car?
Yeah, with the great big fat tires, and yeah, it was not drivable on the road. It was a race car.
Okay. All right. I don't have anything else, Judge.
Any cross-examination?
No, Your Honor.
Is she excused, Mr. Wood?
Yes, Your Honor.
And you are excused. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take our mid-afternoon recess at this point. Let me remind you, please don't discuss this case among yourselves or let anybody else take a break. Don't do any research of any kind. Leave your notes here in the courtroom. It's 2:45 till 3. So let's plan on being back, ready to be back at 5 minutes at 3:05. So be back in the lounge at 3:05. We'll be early. Leave your notes here. Be seated in the courtroom. We'll ask everybody to remain in the courtroom for a few moments until our deputies confirm that there is out of the hallway. And we will be in recess until 3:05. 3:05.